Good evening. Welcome to this evening session of the Belvedere Forum. I'm Patrycja Sasnal. I'm head of research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and I'll be having a conversation with a truly incredible guest, Professor Maya Jasanoff. She's a Coolidge Professor of History at Harvard University and author of 3 books. Just to do justice to the books, I will read their titles. The Edge of Empires, Lives, Culture and Conquest in the East, 1750-1850. Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World. And The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World. The book, the last one, about which we will talk a lot, is just next to us. Professor Jasanoff has won various awards for her work on history, but also on literature. Professor Jasanoff is a literary person of history. She has written for The New Yorker, The Guardian, and the New York Review of Books. She is this year the chair of the Booker Prize, the first American to be holding that position. Maya, good evening, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Patrycja.
I think we have to start with Polish-British cultural interactions, because this is what we're supposed to talk about tonight. And I cannot not ask you this question first about Joseph Conrad in relation to the book you wrote. About his ethnicity, I shy from saying that word even. So would you call him Polish-British, which I think you have sometimes, British-Polish, British or Polish? Does it make sense to be asking this question?
Well, you know, here I am with this little badge. So, you know, I think that the obvious answer is he was both. You know, when he was born, which was in 1857 in present-day Ukraine, of course, to a Polish family, his father wrote a poem to him dedicated to, you know, his birth and to the, hopefully his father had hoped, rebirth of Poland. And there's an early photograph of Conrad, which is inscribed on the back, Pole, Catholic, Szlachcic. And so this is, you know, how he kind of came into the world. But in his later years, he was a very proud adoptive Briton and considered himself, you know, a proud subject of the British Empire. He naturalized as a Briton, but he also described himself at one point as a homo duplex. And I think that's perhaps the best way to think of it, that these two sides were always part of who he was, or I should say the Polish part was always something that he was, and the British part was something that he acquired as he went on in his life. And let's just think of it as always sort of united and conjoined.
But can you describe to us what are these parts? I mean, what did he take from Polishness? What did he take from him being a Brit?
So I think that, you know, there's been so much ink spilled on Conrad, who, you know, of course, made his literary career in English, a language which he learned only in his early 20s, having learned, of course, Polish as his native language and French as a young adult. And there's so much effort that's spent on trying to decide, was he really British? Was he really English? You know, was he really Polish? Was he not? And I think that this is perhaps doing a disservice to the way in which you know, intellectual life operates, in which, you know, one could say European historical identities operated, in which this sense of sort of clear divisions between these worlds was maybe less sharp than we like to say in retrospect. One of the features of his Polish background that Conrad certainly took into his adulthood, which, you know, we can get into the details later, but he spent 20 years as a sailor before he ever became a writer, which is, you know, incredibly critical to his development as well, is this sense of, I think, having come from a Polish community that was without a nation. And that sort of fierce Romantic era nationalism was something that he was invested with from his youth through, again, his father, who was living not far from here in 1861 on Nowy Świat, and arrested by the Tsarist authorities for his nationalism. The family was then sent into exile in Russia. So, you know, the sense of being a Pole, but also being a persecuted subject of an empire, of being a Pole without a nation, and of being a Pole of this particular social class, which felt itself, I think, to have a kind of responsibility or role in the rebirth, as they hoped, of a Polish nation. All of those things were incredibly important to him as he went forward. From Britishness, I think Conrad took a sense of sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it, kind of mission in the world. You know, I think the choice to write in English rather than in French, rather than in Polish, was a choice that was made with the knowledge that English was a global language, that it was, of course, a language that would reach more readers in a quite kind of material sense, but also a language that afforded a kind of internationalism, which he experienced, you know, preeminently first as a sailor. So I think that was very important to him. I think that as time went on, you know, the idea of Britain as a beacon of a certain kind of constitutional liberty was incredibly important to him. And these were, and then I think this sense of almost class. I mean, he had an idea of himself as a Polish gentleman. He even said something to this effect, like a Polish gentleman in the clothing of a British tar, you know, as a sailor. So I think that that was something that also he saw embodied in the Britain of his time.
Right. I could, I guess, put it in different words, which you've just said, taking martyrdom from the one side and a bit of imperialism from the other, but I know it's making it very crude while you have just said it so elegantly. But let's stay with Conrad for a little while to do justice to his person. As a writer, as a sailor, I wonder about his psyche, because I'm drawn to what you write in your book, and I want to quote you. It's that more troubled, complicated sort of person who crops up over and over as a figure in Conrad's novels, and every novel, Conrad conceded in a personal record, contains an element of autobiography. His characters struggle with displacement, alienation, and despair. 17 of them commit suicide. 17 of his people, main characters in his books, commit suicide. Actually, there are other people who corroborate what you write. So W.G. Sebald, in The Rings of Saturn, he took out a terribly pessimistic quote from Conrad's letters to a friend. So was he such a person in despair? What do we know about him? Do you find hope in his writings?
Well, I mean, 17 suicides. I mean, it does sort of say something. And he himself had a suicide attempt, which some biographers sort of gloss over as sort of, you know, oh, that was just youthful romanticism. I don't think that taking a gun and pointing it to your chest and pulling the trigger is easily written off as, you know, just an act of youthful romanticism. He was clearly, you know, what we would say in retrospect, a clinical depressive. He writes very movingly about depression without necessarily using all of the words that we might use today. It's extremely recognizable. And one of the things that he says about this is that he feels himself to be sort of falling down a black pit. So, you know, in moments like that, I don't think that as a psyche, you would be, you know, turning up to chat with Conrad and have him say, oh, you know, tomorrow everything's going to be fine, you know. That's not really the mentality of this person. Nevertheless, you know, one thing that Conrad did throughout his life, and you see in interviews and you see in letters, is that whenever people ascribed something to him, he would then claim that he was not that. So, you know, if they said, well, you're British, he'd say, no, I'm Polish. If they said, you're Polish, no, I'm British. You know, you're depressive. No, I'm not. I'm actually very hopeful. You know, and so this is, of course, given literary critics a lot to work with. And it's also made him, you know, a bit hard to pin down. But I think that you know, leaving aside the question of whether he was simply being, you know, sort of contrary for its own sake, I do think that he is a person who is fundamentally engaged with human complexity. And that, in a more serious sense, gives literary critics something to work with. And I think that as a result, he actually did say now and then that he had hope about things and felt hopeful. And I think that I personally read him as being, extremely mindful of the possibilities for negative change in the world. But he's also somebody who is very attached to certain kinds of ideals. And I suppose the question then is, can you be an idealist, as I think he is, and nonetheless be completely lacking in hope? And I would tend to say no.
Mm-hmm. So I need to ask you about those ideals that he cherished. And only having read your book did I realize that indeed the only credo that he ever explicitly wrote about, emphasized, is in the novel The Nigger of the Narcissus. And I will read that out. Why did he write? Right? Why did he write? What's the goal? He, the artist, speaks to our capacity for delight and wonder, to the sense of mystery surrounding our lives, to our sense of pity and beauty and pain, to the latent feeling of fellowship with all creation, and to the subtle but invincible conviction of solidarity that knits together the loneliness of innumerable hearts, to the solidarity in dreams, in joy, in sorrow. So what do you get from that? Is it, why did he write? Is it to show that there is something, that there is unity between people, that there is some kind of commonality, or was it out of sheer delight with the letters?
Well, I think that, the passage that you quote, he goes on to say that he writes in order to make you see, in order to make you feel. And I think he's certainly channeling this idea that literature can move minds and hearts. In terms of his own ideals, though, clearly the notion of fellowship, of community, and of the commitment of the individual to some cause bigger than her or himself is something that's very important for him. The word solidarity, of course, has resonance here. And it's something that he idealized on the basis of his time on board ships. So this might be just a place to note that, he did spend 20 years as a working sailor. And the profession of sailing at that time had a couple of characteristics that are perhaps worth noting. So one is that, it is a career that involves ranks very, very visibly. There's a captain and there's, the kind of everyday, ordinary seaman. But it was a career that you really entered only by virtue of your skill. You entered at the bottom and you worked your way up. Unlike, many other professions at that time, the military in Britain was only around then sort of reforming in different ways to, promote people on the basis of merit. So in a certain sense, it was a very democratic profession. And he entered it as a foreigner, a Polish-speaking person in the British merchant Marine, and it was open to someone of his profile. So I think that idea that you can sort of, enter a community and be a part of it was something that he was able to see as a sailor. The other thing that was going on at that time, of course, is that the maritime industry was, industrializing. There was this huge shift from the sailing ship to the steamship, and Conrad sailed right across this transition. And over the course of that, he came to romanticize the sailing ship in particular over the steamship as the place in which he saw all the values that he liked best taking hold. Now, when you're taking out a sailing ship, as those of you who are sailors will know, you need to work together as a crew to operate this extremely complex piece of technology that is powered only by the wind. When you take out a steamship, by contrast, as Conrad wrote about very vividly, you're shoveling coal into a boiler. It's an unskilled, proletarianized job, and it's just sort of burning up the coal and chugging along. And so he came to, as I mentioned already, romanticize this idea of the crew, of the fellowship being an important word here, right, of the sailing ship as this kind of, again, community where people are throwing in them, their own lot, into this kind of joint project of taking the ship around the world. So that is where his ideals are vested.
Right. So I wonder, is this global fellowship possible? Because he is, as you have said, the prophet of the global world. He did show the beginnings of globalization. I want to ask you about that. So you have written that terrorist attacks, financial crises, all of that we will find already in his books. Mm-hmm. And that's why he is this first person to be really writing about processes that we're seeing today. Can you unpack that for us? Why do you think he is the prophet of globalization?
So, I first came to Conrad through my work I first came to him as a reader, as a teenager. But then later in life, through my work as a historian of the British Empire. And the author who is typically associated with the British Empire at its height is Rudyard Kipling, who is known for phrases like, poems like The White Man's Burden. Conrad, I thought, offered a slightly different picture of the British Empire. He's writing about different locations. He has a different sort of cast of characters and so on. And so I thought, well, why don't I try to write about the British Empire using Conrad rather than Kipling as a guide? What I quickly found, though, is that, when you map Conrad's fiction, you see that none of it takes place in a British colony. And indeed, even those works that are set in Britain or on British ships tend to feature non-British characters. What I found I was looking at was, in fact, not the pink areas of the map of the British Empire, but rather the network of British, broadly, commercial, cultural, financial influence. What I was looking at is what's sometimes called the informal empire, but even beyond that, what I was looking at was a set of things that look a lot like the global connections that we see even today, where the telegraph lines ran and the internet cables run today, where the sea lanes go, and so on. So part of my argument in saying that Conrad is a kind of voice of globalization is an argument that is based on the simple facts of this man's life and that he put into his fiction, which in turn are indicative, reflective of a period at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when, as many historians have shown, there was an integration of financial markets, a surge in global emigration, a kind of interconnection of communications networks and so on that represented a step change in the scale and range of global connectivity. That was one of the various eras of globalization, as we now use the term, and Conrad was capturing that all in his life and subsequently in his work. Right.
Though you did not talk about imperialism, and I want to ask you about that. We know Conrad, the first book that comes to our minds is The Heart of Darkness, here in this country for sure, probably everywhere. So I wonder, we have all those debates in our countries, in Britain, in the US, in Poland, about monuments, about attitude to history. Does Conrad teach us anything about imperialism, British imperialism, and you have written so much about the British Empire, and you did say that imperialism is not a one-way street, so I wonder what that means. And do you see him as an agent of British imperialism?
In a very narrow sense, I would say no, in as much as his life work was not that of being an agent of British imperialism. I think, there's a lot in the question that you've just asked. One point that I would make is that, globalization as it unfolded in the late 19th, early 20th century was unfolding in a world of empires. You know, the world of empires was the world until very recently. And it's only very recently that we've decided that we're not going to call various forms of international power imperialism, and that there isn't the same kind of extent of formal occupation. We live in a world of nation states now. So, you know, in that sense, I would say that he was a product of an imperial world. Everyone of his time was. And he certainly believed that of all of the empires in the world at the time that he lived, the British Empire was the best. And there's actually a reference to this obliquely in Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe goes to the company office in the place that is not named as Belgium, and sees on the wall a map of the place that is not named as Africa, and says that there was a lot of, you know, red on it, good to see at any time because one knows that real work is being done there, of the place that is not named as the British Empire, right? So, you know, so we can sort of parse through this, but the fact that he doesn't name these things is actually quite interesting, right? And so that goes to another feature of Conrad's work, which is an effort to try to universalize the particular, which we see, of course, happening in Heart of Darkness a great deal. I mean, perhaps the cop-out answer, but the one that I ultimately believe in, to your question about what does he have to teach us about imperialism, is that imperial power can exist, or, you know, shall we say, the power of an outsider minority on a majority in a different geographical location can be exerted even without the formal border drawing that we associate with the term empire. And then I would also say that he is able to sort of tack between the particularities of a situation, a historical set of circumstances that, for example, he might have witnessed in his own time, and more trans-historical kinds of phenomena. And that we would be very misguided, I think, to say that just because, you know, we call things by different names, certain kinds of power dynamics don't any longer exist.
Mm-hmm. But then those contemporary debates and removing monuments, do you see that there is sense to it? And you did not make the connection between imperialism and colonialism. I wonder, and then there's a debate about one of the titles of Conrad's books, which I did mention, to sort of cross out the word from the title. Mm-hmm. And it just takes us from real debates about what's inside the book, right? So I wonder, what is your take on specifically the debate about monuments that somehow epitomize colonialism, slavery, and the past times? Removing them, moving them elsewhere? Or maybe you have a specific case in mind that you could showcase the right or the proper or the convenient attitude of an everyday man to such a debate?
I mean, I'm not sure that I can speak to what Conrad would have thought of different statues, but I mean, you know, obviously, yes. I mean, I think that, you know, I think that it's commonplace now to hear people saying statues represent history and removing statues therefore equals erasing history. What I would say is that removing statues is an act of making history. It's an act of making history to make it look different. And that, you know, we might want to distinguish between, you know, the kinds of things that we attempt to hold up as the values that we seek to, you know, celebrate in a culture in a given moment, and the kinds of things that went into the making of that culture over time. So I think it's a bit of a red herring, frankly, to say that, you know, this debate about removing statues and so on is tantamount to erasing history. I think that we need to do two things. I think we need to teach history. You know, why don't we focus on that? You know, the teaching of history is terrible in many places. I can't speak to Poland. I can speak to the US, where I think it's very limited, and I can speak a little bit to the UK because I've made a study of it, that the teaching of a rich, multivocal, complex history is often deficient. So let's focus on that if we're worried about the place of history in our society. So that's one thing. The second issue is public space. You know, how do we want to handle our public space? And that is a question that obviously deserves discussion. And I think there are many possible answers to that. My own personal view would be that I think it seems to me inappropriate in the present moment to consider that public space ought to be dedicated to figures who exemplify a very limited version of or indeed a prejudiced version of a historical past when the community that inhabits that space looks radically different. So I think that this is a very appropriate discussion to have. What should we have in public space? But it's a different question from the one about how to learn and commemorate and engage with a historical past.
Apologies, I have all those devices that I need to navigate here because the questions are coming in through them. And we already have a couple of questions about Poland, Conrad, and Polish-British relations. But still, I want to draw you out a little bit about this public space and teaching history. Mm-hmm. So, by way of going to the new Museum of Afro-American History in Washington, D.C., I did also go to the Museum of American History, which is an oldish museum next door. And it struck me that the story about the American Civil War is told without an opinion, as if the curators or anyone who thought about this exhibition was careful not to give an opinion about the North, the South. How should we, is this the proper way of telling history? Shunning away from opinions? How do you think we should teach history that is so divisive today? Because the Civil War, I guess, is still an issue in the debate in the US.
Well, I certainly believe that we need to teach it. I mean, I would say this, that, you know, obviously in the US, for those of you who are familiar with it, there's a lot of hand-wringing these days about cancel culture and the idea that there need to be safe spaces and we shouldn't talk about difficult things and so on. So we should talk about difficult things. The classroom is one of the places in which we should do this. That said, I mean, I think that we have a responsibility to teach and to learn in ways that are respectful of the people joining conversations. But I also think that, you know, the idea of pure neutrality is something that I think, you know, ought to have been dispensed with a long time ago. There is evidence, but people draw different kinds of views off the evidence. So, I mean, I'm firmly in favor of evidence, and I'm firmly in favor of evidence-based discussion in classrooms around difficult topics, but I am not in favor of the idea that, you know, we ought to sort of do both sidesism and that everything is all sort of the same and, you know, we need to respect every position equally. You need to be able to support it. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Let's move to the notion of empires, because you're a scholar of the British Empire and probably you know a lot about empire and empire in general. Is the United States an empire? I wonder if
you know. I mean, you know, we just withdrew from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
You know, look, I mean, this can quickly turn into a semantic question, right? I mean, this is where I find Conrad very helpful. What do we mean when we say empire? If what you mean is, you know, a colonial, a presence of boots on the ground in many countries in which you are directing their governments formally through mechanisms of government, you have a viceroy and you have a, you know, obviously not. Right? This is a world of nation states. But if by empire you mean, you know, sort of preeminent force in the world and you mean, you know, the ability to direct other countries', you know, foreign policy or, you know, economies or cultural trends, then, you know, we get into a somewhat, you know, fuzzier sort of territory. And obviously there are superpowers in the world, of which the U.S. is not the only one. And we see that superpowers obviously have a kind of influence in other parts of the world. So again, I mean, I think this, to me, this is a little bit like the monuments question, you know, where we're sort of confusing history with what to do about public space. You know, I think by you know, dwelling on this term empire in the 21st century, when obviously we, you know, the only place, no place in the world right now calls itself an empire, and the only emperor in the world right now is the Emperor of Japan. You know, so it's a red herring, you know, to dwell on this term. The interesting question is, what are we really trying to talk about here? And if what we are really trying to talk about is control of resources or issues of when to intervene in other sovereign territories, or how to set trade policy, or, you know, what the appropriate role of large militaries ought to be in the world today, I think let's have those discussions and let's not get occluded by this sort of, you know, finger-pointing kind of question of what counts as an empire.
Okay. I was just interested by what you did write, that the era of empires is not over. So
no,
I guess,
of course it's not.
Yeah, it's, these empires are still there, and probably China, you would consider China one too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, look at the Belt and Road Initiative. It's pretty interesting to look at where that's happening and to look at, for example, parallel railroad projects being built, you know, alongside the old roads idea of the Cape to Cairo Railroad. What are we seeing now? You know, these are interesting questions. And I think with that in particular, I mean, I'm not a China expert by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the things that characterized British expansion, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, was the, you know, involvement in infrastructure projects and the question of what you do when those infrastructure projects and the investors involved in them are threatened by, you know, changing geopolitical circumstances. And then you see, you know, the occupation of Egypt, for example.
Right.
So it will be interesting, I think, to see what happens to Chinese infrastructure programs and so on in the coming 3 decades.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted us to go from Conrad through empires to those general questions about history, because you study history, and there are so many ideas about what history is, whether we can learn from history. Benedetto Croce would say that all history is contemporary history. Leo Tolstoy would say that there's this divine intervention somehow in history. What is history to you? Do you think humanity, us ourselves, we can learn from history, or there's always this personal experience that you need to live in order to learn?
I'd be out of a job if I thought we couldn't learn from history. I mean, at the most basic sense, what is history? History is about being in time. And we all are being in time. We all exist in time. And one of the reasons, among many, that I believe that students all need to learn history is that we need to learn how to handle change over time. And we need to, you know, if we look at some of the things that were invoked this morning about climate change, for example, you know, clearly, you know, people are deficient in their ability to imagine futures that are going to be affected by the present moment. And I think learning history is a very good way to get better at these kinds of ways of thinking. So, in my view, history is the unfolding of life over time, and that learning to think about different time scales and how change happens is a fundamental thing that we all need to do as people, and we need to do as societies, and we need to do on different scales. And that, you know, I think the other point I would make is that we are none of us, you know, born into a, you know, blank world. You know, we're all born into circumstances and conditions that have been created over the generations before us. And that if we are to learn how to navigate, again, whether as individuals or larger entities, through the world that we live in, we need to understand how that came into being, because it will be what put forward the terms and the constraints and the possibilities within which we move.
Right, so going back to Conrad, if he wrote about main global processes, migration, terrorism, information, communication, transport, what about climate change?
Well, interestingly, he did have things to say about that because of this issue, not necessarily climate change, but the issue of the sail to steam is actually quite resonant when you look at Conrad now. And he says, you know, there's something magnificent, you know, about moving a ship around the world with only the power of nature. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I have seen a few things floated, you know, no pun intended, about trying to redesign ships that will have actually some sort of, you know, power to move these huge, extremely heavy vessels that are being moved today, but to harness the wind again in some way. And, you know, I think that, you know, maybe returning to some of what Conrad had to say about the power of sail and nature in moving ships could be you know, attended to today.
Got it. I invite the audience to ask questions. I have a couple of them coming through online, or so many if you want to ask questions. So perhaps we'll take the audience first. Charles, perhaps you can go first. Please do introduce yourselves when you ask questions.
Charles Grant, CER. Heart of Darkness is a savage indictment of Leopold II's empire in what is now Zaire, Congo. But you also said Conrad was a patriotic British citizen. So did he think the British Empire was okay and the Belgian Empire was not okay? Okay, that's the question. Did he ever say anything about what his views of the British Empire were? Did he talk about it at all?
He definitely thought the British Empire was better than the other ones that he saw. The place that he had his most, you know, reserved the greatest animus for, aside from Russia, for obvious reasons, was, well, and then Germany kind of came up there too, but really was the United States. He was very against the United States, which, you know, at that time was becoming a formal empire. He thought that the British were better than all of them, and you'll see him becoming more and more patriotic, particularly during the years of World War I, not surprisingly. And into the 1920s. You know, I do want to just say one thing about the Congo Free State, because this really touches on the problem with this word empire. The Congo Free State was formed as that, right? It was technically not an empire. It was technically independent. It was technically not Belgian. And Conrad, and you know, many others were able to see through that instantly in their own time. But part of the reasons I think that Conrad is, you know, taking the particulars of his own experience in Congo and generalizing them in Heart of Darkness, I think is because he's wanting to make sort of larger points about how you can see all kinds of abuses taking shape, even under the language of the civilizing mission, which was something that all kinds of people were very happy to embrace. The anti-Congo, anti-Leopold movement that gained enormous ground in Britain and the US and really internationally in the 1890s into the 1900s is quite interesting because, you know, it was a way that, you know, the British, for example, could say, well, we're better than that. You know, we have an empire, but we're much better than those people. And so there's just sort of interesting politics around exactly that question of what the status of the Congo Free State was. And what was reform in the Congo Free State? It was actually to have the Belgian government take it over and run it as a colony.
I'll weave in questions from the audience online. So I think it's an interesting question by Marta Jacek. Today's Poland is where Conrad and his family wanted it? Free, independent, and part of the European community? Mm-hmm. It's a question. How can Conrad and his works influence modern Poland?
You know, that's a little bit beyond my expertise, and I'd love to hear what the audience and what the questioner has to say about that. But yes, I mean, his family's dream was certainly a free and independent Poland. You know, one thing I would say is that, you know, Conrad himself, of course, as many men of, you know, intellectuals of his period, knew that the challenges facing Poland included its geographical position between Russia and Germany. And, you know, I think there's, you know, he wrote a couple of essays, in fact, during World War I, one of which dwells very clearly on this question of how Poland will situate itself. That is obviously a question of, you know, ongoing relevance over the last, you know, 70 years or so. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to kind of venture too far into into areas that I really don't know about. But I would say that, you know, one of the things that I think anyone can take from Conrad's writing is just to understand that the world is a complicated place inhabited by complicated people, and that the tentacles of power don't always extend, you know, neatly through, you know, the organs of particular states, you know. And so I think that that sense that, you know, I imagine that if he were around now, he would want to sort of highlight some of the ways in which, you know, there can be forces that are interfering with or, you know, interfering with freedom and independence, even when you have them on paper.
Right. Pan profesor?
You started your conversation about Polish identity of Conrad, and I just would like to ask you if, don't you think that the most Polish piece of work, novel by Conrad is Under Western Eyes? I cannot imagine that somebody without this British author, without this Polish background, could write such a both about Russia and about the West. And probably in The Secret Agent, we find, you mentioned, of course, his engagement also in the process of regaining of independence. There's a very interesting memory in this time when he returned in 1914 to Poland, and description of Kraków and so on. But generally, so Under Western Eyes, it is sometimes very neglected by the people who write about Conrad, but also about his big political, great political novels. Nostromo, probably the best one, and of course Secret Agent. Is it not that if we read this carefully, we discover this Polish background in this his political thinking? Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the things that I always highlight is that Conrad, you know, was a subject of an empire. He was born as a subject of an empire, and he, of course, went on to be, you know, an adoptive subject in a very different kind of position of another empire. But the tensions around nationalism and around how to get there, with The Secret Agent, obviously, with anarchism as a method, are profound in all of his political writing, as you've highlighted. You know, the other piece that I'd add to the list that you just laid out is his short story Amy Foster, which is a very moving story that describes a man who we can take to be Polish or some Eastern European, who is trying to emigrate to the U.S., and is in a shipwreck. And in the shipwreck, you know, he's kind of taken up by some kind of, you know, immigration agents and thrown into the hold of a ship. And then the ship, you know, runs aground in England. And this man finds himself the survivor of this shipwreck in England, and, you know, doesn't speak any English, and ultimately falls in love with a young village girl, you know, in rural England, who's kind to him. They get married, they have a child, but, you know, in the end, the tragedy of this story is that he never, you know, he speaks to the child in his native language, and the wife doesn't really quite understand. And so there's something there about sort of legibility, translation, dislocation that is deeply, I think, moving and poignant about you know, in this story, and says something too about Conrad's persistent sense of being an outsider, even when he was in Britain.
And a refugee.
And a refugee, a migrant.
Sorry.
Yes, yeah.
I know someone who has Nostromo with him, and Nostromo was mentioned. Stephen, please.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm from Imperial College London, and actually my little story is that I teach scientists to move into science communication. It's like I run an escape committee. And the scientists I teach are quite ambivalent about science, and that's how they become good science communicators. So you'll be interested to hear that I make them read The Shadow Line, because it's about a captain who, well, it's about a sailor who loses trust in his job and then becomes more expert later on when he's offered. So it's a very kind of useful book for me. But my question really is about you suggested when you were a teenager reading Conrad. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking back to my experience when we were encouraged to read Conrad We were told really in England about his values, his great belief in honesty, trust, diligence, hard work. All these virtues were what we were told Conrad is about. Then when I read your book, especially when I read your chapter on Nostromo, I saw really for the first time what a political writer he is. And I think in England we're taught to see Conrad as a kind of virtue ethicist. And your amazing work in kind of showing both his craft and his politics. So I suppose my question, if it is a question, is, you know, how did that kind of work within Conrad? Because clearly he's, if you like, a man of spirit, a man of virtue, a real sense of what's important in life. But your book makes so plain that he was, you know, eaten up by politics. And I think Nostromo, the incredible effort of constructing the state of Costaguana, shows that he took politics. So I think for an English audience, it's interesting, you know, values and politics, and he seems to put that together.
Yes, well, thank you for those reflections. I mean, I think I would note that I suspect that when Conrad is taught today, he is not held up as a model of virtue, but he is more often held up as an exemplum of racism. So a little different. But I think that, you know, I do think that the world of the ship is the place where for Conrad the politics and the personal sort of come together, right? And that set of really, you know, rather conservative with a small c sorts of ideals that he has are a unifying thread. So, for example, in Nostromo, the hero, to the extent there is one, is really Charles Gould, right? Who's the person who's, you know, rather tragically trying to uphold a certain set of do-gooder ideas in a political space that is no longer sympathetic to him, in which you have, on the one hand, a kind of grasping materialist set of nationalists, and then on the other, of course, the foreign capitalists, you know, trying to move in. So, so in that sense, you know, Conrad, I think, is, well, to your point, you know, the model of virtue is a political thing, but it's also a very fated thing. It's not going to flourish, and it is perhaps for that reason that Conrad himself, in his own political commitments, was notably apolitical, much to the chagrin of his several friends, including Cunningham Graham, for example, who were very political and were very angry that he didn't take a stand. And I do think it's a real question, you know, why did Conrad not, for example, sign on to petitions in favor of Roger Casement? You know, why was he quite so quiet about Polish nationalism? You know, it's a worthwhile question, and I think, you know, I would have liked to see him be a little more active, but hey, you know, we can't always impose our own values on others or on the past.
Mm-hmm. I think we need to give the floor to Robin first.
Robin Niblett with Chatham House, just very quickly, and the words slipped out of your mouth occasionally, but I want to focus on it, nationalism.
Yeah.
As somebody who, as you said, can learn lessons from history for the present and maybe for the future, nationalism became such a dirty word in Europe in particular, but maybe not such a dirty word in other parts of the world. Are we in a weird hiatus where nationalism is kind of being off the agenda? And how connected is nationalism to empire? I think so many of us think in Europe that empire is impossible because you'd almost have a national drive to do it, and nationalism is such a dirty off term now. So could you just say something about the connection of nationalism and empire from your understanding and what it tells us about today? Or
Sure. Well, you know, this is another one of these interesting and frankly historically constructed oppositions, in a sense, right, is that in the period of 20th century decolonization, the nation state became the container for anti-colonial political aspiration. But as the newest work on decolonization is starting to show, you know, the nation state wasn't the only possibility, right? There were other kinds of ways of imagining a post-colonial future, which included, you know, again, with a small c, conservative solutions that might have included, you know, re-empowering traditional monarchies and so on, might have included federations of different sorts. And so, you know, with the triumph of a particular kind of nation state in the post-colonial period, we began to see this idea that the nation and the empire were opposed to one another. So I would simply say, again, that this is a very sort of historically constructed thing. I think there's doubtless much to be said about the ways in which the nation as understood after 1945 is different from the nation as understood after, say, 1789. You know, maybe there's something to be said about how the nation after, you know, 1991 or 20-something, you know, is understood. Which is why, again, I mean, you know, if I really sort of boil things down to the basics, I would say that what's at issue here is how do we map together people, places, and power? And the relationship between those tiers changes and has changed over time. And, you know, likewise, you know, there's no uniformity among kinds of empires. There's no uniformity among kinds of nation states. I would favor a sort of richer discussion of what all of these things are. And I think at the present moment, right now, you know, we're seeing a lot of this in action. I mean, even with the COVID situation, which has, I think, opened up all kinds of really important questions about what the nation is and where it sits in relation to others.
Mm-hmm. Panie profesorze, I think you wanted to ask the question.
Ryszard Stemplowski. Two things. First of all, I would like to refer to my neighbor. I think it was not exclusively English or British way of public presenting Joseph Conrad. My parents told me when they gave me Jądro ciemności on my birthday day. Yes, but that was in Polish. And who actually the writer was and who he was writing about. He was writing, they said, about men of honor. And who is men of honor? The man of honor is one you may rely on. A reliable person, honest person, somebody who will come to your rescue in the hour of need, somebody who is helping people, not humanity, people around, practical men, that sort of thing. So virtues, to put it short.
Good in an emergency.
Yes, yeah, that sort of thing. They were not referring to political aspects, perhaps they didn't quite understand it, although they were very political themselves, so it would be astonishing. So nevertheless, it's not entirely or exclusively the British way at the time. It was, but I'm talking about the early 50s. Mm-hmm. Half a century ago, plus 20. So... So rather long ago. And the second question is actually the question to the writer. I had read the book long ago, as soon as it appeared and was available on Kindle. And I would like to know, what do you think about Zdzisław Najder writing?
Right. Great question.
I think his book is fantastic. I mean, I found it indispensable in my own work, and I also found indispensable his translations of Conrad's early correspondence and that of his family into English. I don't speak Polish, so I thought it was terrific. You know, one thing that I'm not in a position to speak, you know, in a very informed way about, but I will simply, you know, allude to, is that when I have spoken to Polish scholars of Conrad, I've, you know, asked about the reception history of Conrad in Poland, and my understanding, perhaps you can, you know, clarify this for me, is that, you know, Conrad's association with this particular sort of nobility and, you know, the ideals of the gentry, you know, made him seem perhaps a little bit undesirable to certain communities in the, you know, mid to later century, part of the 20th century, unlike his father, Apollo Korzeniowski, who was more kind of palatable in certain ways. And that I would imagine that, but again, please, you know, this is really for my hosts here to tell me, that in the last kind of 20 years or so, the way in which Conrad would be received in Poland would be perhaps rather different from how he might have been received in the 1960s. Well, yes, and provided people are reading at all, which is an important question these days.
We're not strong in readership. Maya, another question from the audience online. So in your opinion, what would Joseph Conrad think, and how would he react to the positions of Poland that we have covered a little bit, and the UK in the world today?
Well, you know, of course, you know, the Polish community in the UK is very substantial, and, you know, when Conrad first went there, it was not at all, and I think that's quite, you know, I found it, you know, I took a trip some years ago. It was right around the year of the Brexit referendum, and I visited Lowestoft, which is, you know, in eastern England, and the place where Conrad first touched down. And it has a large Polish community, you know, and so there's a pub there called the Joseph Conrad. It's a Wetherspoons pub, and, you know,
and they voted leave.
Yes, and then, you know, and so, but there are these Polish shops, and, you know, so it's very interesting, you know, to see where this all is. But I mean, I do think that Conrad, you know, is indicative of something that you know, I have always thought is a great thing about Britain in the modern, you know, era, which is an openness to outsiders. You know, why did Conrad go to the UK? He went because it had the most open merchant marine. He stayed because it was a place that he could become naturalized. Obviously, there are other countries that have this as well in various ways, but, you know, the UK did kind of stand out. I might, you know, here also note that, you know, I speak here at this forum on Polish-British relations as myself, you know, somebody whose great-grandparents were Jews born in Białystok, you know, but also who has a British cultural imprint through the empire. And, you know, it's interesting to see how borders can be crossed, and Conrad himself as a border crosser, I can only imagine, would have been, you know, happy to see more porous borders than not.
Mm-hmm. My final question to you, unless there's someone in the audience who still wants to ask a question, please do.
It's me. Coming back to a subject.
Could you please introduce yourself for the guest?
My name is Elizabeth Królikowska-Avis, a former correspondent based in the UK for about 30 years. Recently, I've been to Singapore. I've been a few times. Mm-hmm. But recently, 5 years ago, it turned out that the Singaporean erected beautiful monument of Joseph Conrad. Have you seen it?
Yes, it's outside the Fullerton Hotel.
Look, part of the former British Empire, now free country, erect is honor that Joseph Conrad been there, because he been there, and wrote about Singapore. So perhaps, you know, it is complicated, this relationship. Joseph Conrad and Singapore and the British Empire is much more complicated than we are talking about right now. Another thing, I used to live many years in Brighton, East Sussex County. You know that Joseph Conrad lived in 4 or 5 villages in Sussex, East Sussex County. So I made a research from the first 2 flats of his in London, in Pimlico Borough, and later on these 5 places in 5 villages when he lived. 3 of these house owners knew about it, about Joseph Conrad, who used to live there.
Perhaps we can make your comment, if you permit. Perhaps we can make your comment into a question about you traveling in the footsteps of Joseph Conrad.
Okay, just one more sentence. In the graveyard of Joseph Conrad is located in Canterbury. And now I would like to make our conversation, debate memorable, and to ask our English friend to make erase the error in Joseph Conrad's name in Canterbury graveyard, please.
That's a good point. Is there
because it's an error in Korzeniowski.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Maya, could you tell us about your travels also in the footsteps of Conrad in Singapore?
Well, I mean, this
Poland.
would be how many more hours, save it for after some drinks. But yes, I mean, I think, to the point about Singapore, I mean, none of his major novels is set in a British colony. Singapore does, of course, crop up in his writing. And, it's one of the places in which... it's one of the places that really stands out in this geography of globalization that's the same, from his time to now. Why? Well, the Straits of Malacca, there's still a choke point for global trade. And so one of the trips that I took in Conrad's footsteps was on a container ship from Hong Kong to Britain, and of course we stopped in Singapore, and I got out and walked around and saw the monument outside the Fullerton Hotel and felt that it was all very, very, very resonant. Yeah.
Thanks. So final question. I do see your hands, but we really need to finish. I wanted to ask you about the motto in your book, which is a quotation from Conrad's Victory. I am the world itself, come to pay you a visit. Can you unpack this for us for the end?
Well, I mean, it's a great line. And you have to take a great line when you see it. But, that line was suggested to me during my process of working on this by a literary agent and writer who was very invested in Conrad and was, an important sort of source for me in talking through Conrad's life and work. And he said, this line is something you need to think about. And he sadly passed away just before the book was finished. So I sort of had that in my mind. But I also was thinking that, I'm trying to say something about Conrad himself being this, harbinger of or witness to a global era that we are living in, the era of, and the idea of a person being the world itself, a person embodying a certain global vision was something that I had in mind there. Now, I should say that in the context of Victory, this line is said in a rather, sinister kind of way, and I would simply underline that, globalization is a term that we use to describe a set of conditions. It is in and of itself a value-neutral term, but clearly there are values that we can attach to the things that it describes. And I think that Conrad is somebody that I certainly don't always agree with, and I don't expect any readers now would always agree with. But I think he's somebody who points to the complexities that surround this idea. And so, if he is the world itself come to pay us a visit, I like to think that what he's telling us when he's knocking on the door is that we need to, be attentive to the complexities of international exchanges.
Maya, what a pleasure it's been to be able to talk to you and listen to you. I just wanted to say that what I take from you, your book and Conrad, is that he's a migrant, a traveler, an observer of human complexity that connects it all. So probably this is one of the features of globalization too. Thank you so much. Please stay with us. I have two announcements still to make. One is that there are books in English and Polish as gifts to you, the audience. Maya will be signing them. Please go out, take her book, and come to her for an autograph. The second announcement is that tomorrow we start at 9:30, which is 8:30 British time. So please be tomorrow on time. And now to the books. Thank you.